Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 3826.
Objection.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Suspend.
This is not in order.
Okay.
The House will be in order. Pursuant to the House Resolution 497 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 3826. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 3826, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to provide direction to the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency regarding the establishment of standards for emissions of any greenhouse gas from fossil fuel-fired electric utility generating units and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recommended suspend. The House will come to order. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise this afternoon in support of H.R. 3826, Electricity Security and Affordability Act. Recently, a constitutional law professor at George Washington University named Jonathan Turley issued a dire warning. Now, Professor Turley said that he voted for President Obama in the last election, that he agrees philosophically with President Obama on many issues, but he said that if left unchecked, the U.S. president could effectively become a government unto himself. Now, he was referring to the fact that this president has been overly aggressive in the use of executive orders and regulations through various governmental agencies to accomplish his political goals. And the reason that we are here today is with this legislation, it is our hope that we can overturn one of the most extreme regulations of the Obama administration. In January of next year, it is anticipated that they will finalize a rule from EPA that will make it impossible to build a new coal power plant in America. Now, that's hard to believe that that can be the situation in our great country, particularly since 40% of our electricity comes from coal. The reason that it will be impossible to build a new coal-powered plant because of these new EPA regulations is the fact that the emission standards have been set so high, and I might add that it's pretty clear that those emission standards, the way they were set, violates the Energy Security Act of 2005. We've written a letter to EPA setting out our concerns. They still have not responded to us. We've talked to lawyers throughout the country who are ready to file a lawsuit if this happens, because it's impossible to believe that the 3 plants in America that they use to set the emission standards for new coal-powered plants, none of those plants are in existence today. None of them are operating today. So our legislation, we believe, is a reasonable approach to a serious problem for America. I might add that 41 out of 50 states last year indicated that their electricity rates have gone up under the Obama administration. Now, I know that the President is greatly concerned about the less fortunate in our society. He's talked a lot about the minimum wage bill, for example. But these electricity rates going up hit the most vulnerable in our society the most, particularly those on fixed income. And yet it is his policies that are driving up these electricity costs. So the legislation that we have on the floor today is very simple. First of all, it acknowledges for the first time by legislation that EPA can regulate greenhouse gases. This bill goes farther than any other bill has. So you can regulate greenhouse gases. But when you set the emission standard, the unit must be in operation for a period of time, must be commercially available to the utilities to buy it, as opposed to the proposed regulation in which the technology is simply not available. So our legislation, as I said, we don't anticipate a new coal-powered plant to be built anytime soon in America because our natural gas prices are so low. But in Europe, which is acknowledged as the green sector of the world, they mothball 30 gigawatts of gas-powered plants in the last 20 months because the gas prices coming from Russia are so expensive that it's raising their electricity rates to such an extent that it's damaging the area. So with our legislation, if those gas prices go up, an option available to the American people, to the American utility sector, is they can go out and build a coal-powered plant with reasonable regulations. And then the second thing that our legislation does, and when I say our, I'm talking about Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, has introduced this bill in the U.S. Senate. I, along with Democratic support, were able to get it out of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And so this debate is vitally important today because the President is going so fast in such an extreme way that will make it impossible to use coal in America with a new plant. And we've never had a national debate on the issue. So today, we can at least have this debate. The second thing that our legislation does applies to existing plants. EPA said they're going to regulate existing coal plants. And we say go ahead and do it, set the standards, but Congress will set the effective date for that regulation. So it's a very simple piece of legislation, one that I think is necessary to protect the American people and to ensure that America remains competitive in the global marketplace. And I might also say that with these electricity, in addition to that, I might want to make one other comment. Emissions from the energy sector in America is the lowest. CO2 emissions are the lowest that they've been in 20 years. So America does not have to take a back seat to anyone on having a clean emission standard and regulations. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, wrote in the Washington Post earlier this year, quote, "Climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. It threatens the well-being of hundreds of millions of people today and many billions more in time," end quote. Robert Rubin, the former Treasury Secretary, said recently, quote, "There are a lot of really significant, monumental issues facing the global economy, but this supersedes them all," end quote. The Energy and Commerce Committee is the committee in the House that has the power to tackle this monumental issue, this biggest challenge of our time. But we are missing in action. Instead of listening to the scientists and working on a bipartisan basis to protect the planet for our children and future generations, we're considering today a science denial bill that would strip the EPA of authority to stop dangerous carbon pollution. The Venerable John Dingell, the longtime chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, is famously known for pointing to a photo of the Earth, which I have here to the right, to describe the committee's jurisdiction. Under his leadership, the committee was known for listening to the experts, tackling the toughest problems, and crafting responsible, science-based policies. But today, we need a new symbol to represent what we are doing. The Energy and Commerce Committee has joined the Flat Earth Society. We're considering a very similar bill. We consider a very similar bill to this one last Congress. And here's what Nature, one of the world's leading science journals, said at the time, quote, "Misinformation was presented as fact. Truth was twisted, and nobody showed any inclination to listen to scientists, let alone learn from them." It has been an embarrassing display, not just for the Republican Party, but also for Congress and the U.S. citizens it represents. It's hard to escape the conclusion that the U.S. Congress has entered into intellectual wilderness, the Flat Earth Society. The United States is a major contributor to climate change. It cannot be stopped without us. We have a moral responsibility to act, but the Republican majority has brought a bill to the floor that does just the opposite. It makes the problem worse by preventing EPA from acting. If we pass this terrible bill, we will vote to let China leap ahead of us in the race to build the clean energy economy for the future. And we will be ignoring our moral obligation to protect the planet for our children and grandchildren. As you might have guessed, I strongly oppose this bill. Future generations will be appalled that we are considering it today. Coal-fired power plants are the largest single source of carbon pollution in the country. Today, there's no limit on how much carbon pollution these power plants can emit. That's why President Obama directed the Environmental Protection Agency to use its existing authority under law, under the Clean Air Act, to require power plants to control carbon pollution. EPA has proposed a rule to require new coal plants to use available control pollution technology to capture and sequester carbon. For existing coal plants, EPA is working with stakeholders to think through the best approach. But H.R. 3826, the bill under consideration today, would stop EPA from issuing any rules and allow these plants to continue to keep emitting unlimited amounts of carbon pollution. Republicans complain they don't like EPA's approach, but they won't even admit climate change is a problem, much less accept the President's invitation to work together on a solution. Instead, they want to pass a bill to deny the problem, block EPA action, and weaken the Clean Air Act. My message to my Republican colleagues is simple. If you don't like what EPA is doing, tell us your plan. If you have other ideas for reducing carbon pollution to prevent catastrophic climate change, let's hear about them. But if you don't, you should step aside and let the President lead. Today is an embarrassing day for our Committee on Energy and Commerce and the U.S. House of Representatives if this bill is to be passed. And I hope that does not come about. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Yes, sir. At this time, I would yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, the Majority Whip, Mr. McCarthy.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, in 2008, in an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle, President Obama warned us that under his policies for energy, electricity rates will necessarily skyrocket. Now, it appears high electricity costs, that this is a promise that the President chose to keep. Today, millions of Americans are suffering from one of the coldest winters in recent memory, and in some cases, the most expensive. In New York, some homes are seeing their heating bills double. But it doesn't have to be this way. The U.S. is currently enjoying a revolution in energy production, the energy that heats our homes and keeps us warm during the cold winter nights. Americans across this country should be celebrating this breakthrough. In an economy where the nation income today is lower than in the year 2000, abundant energy should provide a sense of relief to strained budgets. But because of this administration's policies, Americans are simply left out in the cold with their energy bills. First, the Democrats tried cap and trade, but that failed in a Democrat-led Congress. Now this administration has proposed, arguably, the most expensive regulation ever by the EPA, one that would render the construction of any future coal power plant impossible through the mandating of technology that isn't readily obtainable. Today, coal accounts for 37% of total U.S. electricity production. The EPA's regulation will cost approximately $1,200 per household per year in lost income. That's $100 more a month. But most importantly, this regulation will cause the greatest amount of harm, lost jobs, diminished incomes, and higher electricity bills in areas where incomes are modest and are the lifestyles of those who live there. It isn't the rich on Fifth Avenue or in Beverly Hills that will be impacted. It's the American working class. Communities like Indiana's 2nd District, home to our good friend Congresswoman Jackie Jaworski, or Ohio's 4th District, home to our friend Jim Jordan, or the 1st District, home to Chairman Ryan, or even Wisconsin's 2nd or in Iowa's 1st District, both represented by my colleagues on the other side, and all will be unnecessarily hurt by this regulation. And for all the talk from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about fairness, this regulation is profoundly unfair. The Electricity Security and Affordability Act, sponsored by my friend Ed Whitfield, rejects the administration's backdoor tax on Americans' energy bill. This legislation restores opportunity and fairness by ensuring more Americans' paychecks do not unnecessarily go to expanding electricity and heating costs. Mr. Chairman, at a time when energy production is booming, the cost for families should be dropping, not rising. I suppose the President actually held true to another promise. He has promised an all-the-above energy policy. I'd hope that meant increasing energy production from all sources, not increasing prices on all consumers. I urge my colleagues to reject the President's plan for higher energy costs and support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, the previous speaker said that heating oil prices are going up, energy costs are going up. Well, if they're going up, it's not because of what President Obama has done by regulation, because he has not adopted any regulations through EPA. The bill before us would stop any regulations from being adopted under current law. They would change the current law and say nothing could be adopted in the future. The chairman of the subcommittee on energy made the statement, no coal power plants are being proposed. Yet, what he's also suggesting is that we not allow them to be built in the future should they want to be built in a way that would reduce the pollution of carbon. What's unfair? It seems to me what is unfair is that coal-burning power plants can burn all the coal they want and put out all the pollution they want, and we're allowing it even though everyone is suffering from the consequences. So I find it amazing to hear the arguments. One, coal-burning power plants are not going to be built. On the other hand, we're already paying higher prices, and nothing has even passed by the EPA and put into effect. At this time, I want to yield 5 minutes to my colleague from California, Mr. McNerney.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I want to thank the ranking member for yielding 5 minutes. And I want to talk a little bit about this bill, H.R. 3826. Basically, from where I can see, H.R. 3826 will essentially prevent the EPA from limiting coal-fired power plant emissions, including health-endangering pollution as well as carbon. Well, we're all interested in health, but I want to talk a little bit about carbon pollution. Climate change is one of the most important national issues we face right now, and the evidence for climate change is overwhelming, whether it's superstorms that are occurring more regularly now, whether it's record-changing droughts, whether it's migration patterns of biological systems, melting of the polar ice caps, and a related issue to carbon emissions is ocean acidification. All of these current phenomena are very dangerous and very threatening. The leading scientists of this nation and around the world agree that this is a threat, that it's a problem. In fact, about 97% of climate scientists believe this is a problem. And the predictions and the models for the climate sciences are horrifying enough, but unfortunately, actual measurements and actual predictions and happenings are worse than the predictions, than the actual models are predicting. So we're facing a very dangerous situation. And I asked my colleagues, why are you willing to take this risk? Climate change is a very big problem. It's a very big risk. 97% of the scientists agree that it's a risk, and yet we're going to say, well, it's not really a risk. We can worry about that later. No, we have to worry about it right now, today. The good news out there is that this carbon capture and sequestration technology is coming along pretty well. What this bill would do, unfortunately, is prevent carbon sequestration technology from being adopted in power plants. But I submit that allowing carbon sequestration technology to be developed is in the interest of the coal industry. If the technology is developed and climate change keeps happening, which it is, then the public is going to demand that we incorporate climate change, carbon sequestration technology, and if it's not there, then coal plants are going to be shut down. So now, when we have the opportunity, the technology is being developed, there's money being spent by the federal government, by private industry to develop carbon capture and sequestration. Let's go ahead and take advantage of that, implement it in our power plants on a limited basis now, so that when the need is there, it'll be available. I don't understand why that is being ignored. But H.R. 3826 ignores that and other possibilities. It prohibits us from using existing carbon capture projects in the United States as technical basis for implementing that technology in coal-fired power plants. We must take advantage of this technology. We must take advantage of it in the United States and abroad. We shouldn't prevent the development of this technology. CCS technology is improving, it's being more cost-effective, and it's being more effective technologically. It's in the best interest, again, of the coal, long-term coal industry, and I strongly urge opposition to this bill. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I would just reiterate that America doesn't have to take a back seat to anyone on its emissions from energy sources. Our emissions today are lower than they were 20 years ago. Why should the U.S. unilaterally take this extreme position? And other countries around the world, particularly in Europe and in Asia, are using coal, and we don't even have the flexibility to do that when they finalize this rule. So that's what we're up to today. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, many families and businesses have had to spend more to heat their homes this cold and snowy winter. Unfortunately, regulations recently introduced by unelected elites of President Obama's EPA will increase the utility and electric bills further. These regulations effectively ban new power plants by forcing them to meet an emission standard that cannot be achieved with any commercially available technology. They are unworkable and unaffordable and will result in more lost jobs. I stand in solidarity with the hard-working coal miners, power plant workers, steel workers, boiler makers, carpenters, and truck drivers. But the victims of the President's war on affordable energy are the families and businesses whose energy costs are skyrocketing and the workers who are losing their jobs and incomes because of these regulations. I strongly support H.R. 3826, the Electricity Security and Affordability Act. The bill will direct the EPA to adopt new coal-fired power plant emission standards that make sense and subject any new regulations on existing power plants to congressional review where the people's representatives can be held accountable. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to approve this job-saving bill. I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, House Republicans are telling us greenhouse gas emissions are falling in the United States. They suggest the U.S. doesn't need to do anything more about climate change, but they couldn't be more wrong. A couple of years ago, when the utilities were switching out of coal and going to natural gas because natural gas was cheaper, we saw some leveling off of those emissions. But what matters most is whether the U.S. emissions are on track to decline in the future by the amount needed to prevent dangerous climate change. Scientists say we need to reduce carbon pollution by 80% by 2050, but we'll not get anywhere near that level of reductions if we go about business as usual and stop EPA from acting and Congress doing nothing to respond to this emergency. I'd like to yield at this time 4 minutes to the gentlelady from California, a member of our committee, Ms. Capps.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Mr. Chairman, you know there's an argument on the other side of the aisle, and in fact we heard it just a few minutes ago, that we shouldn't take action to address climate change because doing so will hurt poor people. It's a particularly galling statement because the truth is that the world's poor, the world's poorest, have the most to lose if we don't take urgent action to cut carbon pollution. Poor people are on the front lines of climate change. World Bank President Jim Yong Kim says that unless we address climate change, and I quote, we could witness the rolling back of decades of development gains and force tens of millions more to live in poverty, end quote. According to the United Nations Development Program, without coordinated global action to address climate and environmental threats, 3 billion more people could be pushed into extreme poverty by 2015. That's the reality. The world's poorest will be the most affected by the impacts of climate change, and yet they have the fewest resources to adapt to or respond to it. To hear the other side tell it, the only way to protect the health of the well-being of poor people is to weaken EPA's ability to cut carbon pollution. And that's nonsense. It's time to stop denying the science and accept reality. We need to take action now to cut carbon pollution. The longer we wait, the higher the cost will be, especially for the poor. Indeed, addressing climate change is in the economic self-interest of all of us. Consider recent comments by Robert Rubin, who was a universally respected Treasury Secretary. During his tenure, the budget deficit was reduced from $290 billion to $70 billion. The Dow Jones Industrial Average more than tripled, unemployment decreased to 4.3%, and more than 18 million new jobs were created. Senator Bob Dole described Secretary Rubin as a man of honesty and integrity. Alan Greenspan called him one of the most effective secretaries of the Treasury in this nation's history. When he resigned in 1999, Secretary Rubin received glowing tributes from Democrats and Republicans alike. Over the past year, Secretary Rubin has focused on the threat of climate change to our economic well-being. Here is what he said about climate change a few weeks ago, and I quote, "There are a lot of really significant monumental issues facing the global economy, but this one supersedes all else. Experts are telling us that inaction on climate change threatens the global economy. Responding to this threat isn't about disadvantaging ourselves, it's about seizing opportunities. There are already 143,000 solar jobs and 80,000 wind jobs in the United States. Winning the global clean energy race will mean millions of jobs and faster economic growth. Our competitors in China and Europe understand this. We risk being left behind if we don't recognize it as well. We should abandon this bill and start getting serious about climate change and the economy. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from California yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
May I ask how much time is remaining on both sides?
The gentleman from Kentucky has 19 minutes remaining. The gentleman from California has 16 minutes remaining.
At this time, I would like to recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolarski, for 2 minutes.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 3826, and I appreciate Congressman Whitfield's leadership on this common sense bill. I am proud to be an original co-sponsor. This bill addresses President Obama's sweeping proposed rule for new power plants, which sets emission standards so strict that the creation of a new coal-fired power plant is virtually impossible. Indiana is the backbone of manufacturing in America, but manufacturing depends on affordable energy. More than 80% of Indiana's electricity is coal-powered, and electricity rates in Indiana are expected to rise 32% by 2023, partly due to these EPA regulations. If President Obama is able to implement his radical environmental agenda, energy prices could skyrocket, having a devastating impact on economic growth and job creating, hurting Hoosiers trying to pay their bills. This bill provides a common sense way to protect our environment by setting emission standards that are actually achievable. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Indiana yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield now 3 minutes to the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Rahal.
The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee yielding me this time, especially since we do not see eye to eye on this particular piece of legislation. We do see eye to eye on numerous other issues before the Congress and the American people, such as protecting the health and safety of our nation's coal miners and our American workers. And indeed, we all, both sides of the aisle, share the common goal of wanting to provide clean water, clean air, and health and safety for our families each and every day of the year. In that sense, we all have that common ground. There is a fear, though, in the coal fields today, and I really wish the distinguished majority whip on that side of the aisle had mentioned my home state of West Virginia, one of the largest coal-producing states in the country, when he mentioned and was going district by district about the various people that are going to be affected by these proposed regulations. But I do rise in support of H.R. 3826 as a co-sponsor, and I commend my coal country colleague Ed Whitfield for his leadership on this issue and bringing it through his committee. Those of us from the coal-producing regions of this country have truly become sick and tired of this EPA churning out anti-coal regulations while showing little or no appreciation of how these regulations will affect the lives and the livelihoods of the real people who have to work and live under them. Now, granted, some are proposals, but nevertheless, I remind my colleagues, it strikes fear. It strikes fear in the very heart and soul of coal country. And many of our coal companies that are laying off workers as we speak have this fear of what's coming down the pike as the main factor in laying off workers today. Granted, there are many other factors affecting the current slump in the coal fields. I don't deny that for 1 minute. But we have been frustrated with an EPA that has time after time and time again pushed out piles of guidance documents, regulations, using slanted science and inflating claims about the benefits of their regulatory agenda without any consideration, one iota, of the effects upon jobs in the real America that their regulatory agenda means. Last September, when the EPA proposed regulations limiting greenhouse gas emissions for future power plants, it did so hinged upon the promise that the technologies required to achieve the new standards were proven and ready. Based on this claim, we have to question whether this EPA is actually using good, sound science or if it is picking and choosing science that sounds good to meet whatever ends the agency desires. There are no power plants. There are no power plants in commercial service anywhere in the world that have installed and operated the CCS technologies necessary to comply with the proposed rule. None. Nada. The proposed greenhouse gas rule for new power plants may be the mother of all anti-coal. May I have one additional minute?
Yield the gentleman an additional 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for
I
additional
thank
minute.
the distinguished ranking member again. The proposed greenhouse gas rule for new power plants may be the mother of all anti-coal regulatory measures so far promoted by this particular EPA. It spells curtains for the development of new coal-fired capacity in this country, and that means decreased energy reliability and increased the cost for American families and businesses. And what's more, the agency readily admits that the new regulations will have nearly zero impact on the emissions of greenhouse gases as economies around the globe continue to grow their use of coal power. That's why this legislation is so important. It would block the EPA from unilaterally imposing these caps, requiring that any such efforts be approved by the Congress, and would help set a course for the development of cutting-edge CCS technologies needed to ensure reliable, affordable coal-fired energy for America throughout the foreseeable future. From those of us from coal country, this legislation is fundamental to preserving the jobs of our coal miners, those who work hard every day going beneath the bowels of this earth to produce the energy that fuels this nation and the economies of our communities, and indeed a national energy security for the United States. I urge support of this legislation.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
This time I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my thanks also to Mr. Whitfield, my colleague from Kentucky, and also my thanks to my colleague who I'm lucky to follow, Mr. Rahal from West Virginia, for talking about such an important issue to my district in central Illinois. One of the reasons I'm here, Mr. Speaker, is because I saw the devastation. The largest employer in my home county 20 years ago closed down because of a signature on a piece of paper here in Washington, D.C. Peabody Mine Number 10 shut down, and coal mining families whose children I went to school with and grew up with, were forced to move to get a job once again. Now we see this attack via the EPA on coal in Middle America once again. And I stand here today with my colleagues to say this bill is a common sense proposal that's going to restrict the EPA's ability to overreach and cost families, all families, even the poorest families in this country, that's going to cost them more out of their family budget to turn the light switch on. It's going to cost jobs in my district at existing coal-fired power plants that are some of the best jobs in central Illinois. They're organized labor jobs. This is about jobs, this is about the economy, and this is about low-cost power that allows our economy to grow. That's what we all want, Mr. Speaker, isn't it? I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to point out that the speakers in favor of this bill describe themselves as part of the coal-producing regions of the country. They are representing, they think, the coal-producing regions of the country because they fear if the coal industry had to use some technology that would reduce carbon emissions, that would cost jobs. Now, I want to dispute that in two respects. One, they claim that no one is using this technology, and that's not accurate. In fact, the control technology is already in effect, being used commercially in the United States for decades. There are 7 large commercial CCS, that's carbon capture and sequestration projects operating today. And Dr. Julio Friedman, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Clean Coal at the U.S. Department of Energy, recently testified, quote, first-generation CCS technology is commercially available today. So why are they worried about jobs? Well, they're being told by the coal miners that if they have to use a technology that costs money, that would raise the price of coal, and therefore coal will lose out to other technologies. Well, that hasn't been the case. I've been in Congress for 40 years. I remember the coal industry coming in and saying, if we have to put scrubbers on, we'll go broke. They'll never burn coal again. The coal industry uses scrubbers right now. The cost of scrubbers has gone down. They overstated how much it would cost. They cried about the lost jobs. It didn't happen. The other thing I want to point out is that they talk about the coal jobs that will be lost. Well, coal jobs are being lost now because the utilities realize they can burn natural gas. It's cheaper. So coal is losing out in the market. If natural gas is cheaper than burning coal now, they're going to burn natural gas. That's called the market. It's like cars replacing horse and buggies. But the reality is that coal is going to be able to compete if we have new technologies imposed on them, just as they have been able to compete in the future. They can compete if they're expensive, so they've got to figure out ways to produce coal that's less expensive. That may happen. But we shouldn't subsidize coal to compete by having the world have to deal with carbon pollution. We decided years ago we weren't going to help coal compete by poisoning people with toxic mercury pollution when we required they use the technology to stop toxic mercury pollution. We decided they had to use scrubbers. They said they'd go broke. They couldn't afford it. That people would lose their jobs. But we required it because it reduced pollution that harmed people. Carbon pollution harms people in this planet. If we see the impact of climate change continue because we refuse to require them to use less carbon and spew it out into the atmosphere. Let me just say, you don't have to buy all the arguments on climate change, but consider this. If there's a 10% chance that carbon pollution is going to cause greenhouse gases and climate change and do all the terrible things that the scientists overwhelmingly tell us will happen, if there's a 10% chance, how many people want to take that 10% chance on the only atmosphere that we share on this planet? I know that the coal people say they don't want to, they're willing to take that chance. They're afraid their constituents will turn against them because the coal plants will, or coal companies will tell them to turn against them. They may lose their next election. I don't think that's the case, but that's their fear. They're speaking for fear. They're speaking from a fear of jobs being lost. But that hasn't been the experience under the Clean Air Act, and we shouldn't repeal the Clean Air Act now as it relates to giving the EPA the authority to regulate these coal-burning power plants. Mr. Chairman, I want to reserve the balance of our time. I don't know if we're ready to close yet, so we'll reserve the balance of our time at this moment, and then we'll pick up with using our time as others have a chance to speak.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I might just make a comment. I can assure you we're not speaking from fear today. I can assure you we're not being parochial about coal. Coal is still the base load for this country's manufacturing, industrial use, electricity at home, and our ability to compete in the world. I have great admiration and respect for the gentleman from California, and I'm sorry that he's made a decision to leave Congress after a distinguished career. But I can tell you there is no power plant operating in America today using carbon capture and sequestration because the technology is not available. Now, there are some plants being built with government support, would not be built without that government support, but they're not in operation. There's a difference when scrubbers were mandated by EPA. Scrubbers were already being put in plants at private expense. The government didn't pay for those scrubbers. They were already being in use. Unlike this proposed regulation, there is no technology available to meet the emission standard. So there's a significant difference in what has happened and what is being proposed. At this time, I'd like to recognize the distinguished chairman of the full Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Upton of Michigan, for 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, today we're going to continue our pursuit of an all-of-the-above energy strategy, taking up legislation to address EPA's pending greenhouse gas rules for power plants, the latest threat by the Obama administration to affordable and reliable energy. And while the President may boast support for an all-of-the-above strategy, their policies have been anything but. The President's approach seeks to limit our energy choices, jeopardizes jobs, raises energy costs, and indeed threatens America's global competitiveness. Our nation has become the envy of the world because of recent breakthroughs unlocking vast amounts of oil and natural gas. But the game-changing developments do not give cause to regulate an entire fuel category out of the mix, gone, especially a resource that comprises today 40% of the fuel that provides affordable electricity for millions of Americans and countless job creators. Given that the U.S. has the world's largest coal reserves and is the largest producer of coal, it should remain a critical contributor to a diverse electricity portfolio for decades to come. And we should proudly embrace that we are the Saudi Arabia of coal reserves. Fuel diversity gives us the flexibility to keep electricity costs low and ensure reliability, particularly for the most vulnerable. As we've heard from many witnesses in hearings, the coal-fired power plant shutdowns already underway pose a serious threat to reliability in many regions, particularly in the Midwest. And that threat will continue to get worse if these shutdowns increase in the years ahead while we limit our options for new baseload power. In sum, fuel diversity gives us a more stable, reliable, and affordable electricity supply. And any threat to coal, including EPA's pending rules, is a threat to that diversity and a threat to affordable energy. I applaud Chairman Whitfield, Senator Manchin, both, for their efforts in authoring a workable, bipartisan, and bicameral approach, working together, to EPA's pending power plant rules. Their legislation is a good faith effort that requires a critical check on EPA's misuse of the Clean Air Act to try to accomplish through regulation what was rejected by Congress through legislation. Their approach does not prohibit EPA from setting a standard for new plants, but instead focuses on setting standards that have been adequately demonstrated, a key ingredient missing from EPA's regulatory proposal. Just in the last 2 weeks, as Mr. Whitfield indicated, we have heard testimony from administration officials that carbon capture technologies, which are not yet commercially viable, could increase electricity costs by perhaps as much as 80%. This important legislation provides a role for Congress in setting the effective date for any regulation for existing plants. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from California is
Mr.
recognized.
Chairman, may I inquire how much time we have on each side?
The gentleman from California has 7 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Kentucky has 12 minutes remaining.
I'm going to reserve our time.
Thank you.
Gentleman
At
from
this
California
time,
reserves.
I would like to
Gentleman
recognize the
Kentucky.
gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 3826, the Electricity Security and Affordability Act. The United States is fortunate to have more coal than any other country in the world. This vital resource is currently used to meet nearly half of our electricity needs and support over 550,000 jobs. As a representative of Ohio, a state that produces more than 24 million tons of coal per year and uses it to generate over 50% of our electricity, I understand firsthand the importance of keeping this abundant and affordable natural resource a part of America's energy supply. Unfortunately, over the past 5 years, this administration's policies have led to the closure of hundreds of coal-fired plants across the country. In fact, in just 1 year, Ohio's coal-generated electricity dropped nearly 20% as a result of the current regulatory environment. The EPA's recent proposed greenhouse gas standards for new coal-fired plants are only the latest example of the administration's regulatory assault on America's power sector. Not only do these standards rely on a technology that is not even commercially viable at this point, they will also lead to the loss of thousands of jobs and drive up the price of energy for American families and businesses that are already struggling to make ends meet. Ohio alone stands to lose an estimated 18,000 manufacturing jobs by 2023 as a result of these overreaching regulations. More than 1,000 of these jobs will be in my district. These estimates do not even include job losses by coal miners, utility workers, and all those impacted directly by plant closures. Rising energy costs are one of the main problems facing many hardworking Americans. While we are all impacted by these rules, it is the most vulnerable citizens who unfortunately will be hit the hardest. It is the 387,000 Ohioans that are living well below the poverty line and spend almost 30% of their income on energy costs that these standards will hurt the most. These standards are not just an attack on coal, they are an attack on those individuals who are having to choose between paying their electric bills and providing the basic necessities of their family. This bill before us offers a realistic alternative to EPA's misguided and unachievable approach.
I'll yield the gentleman one additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized for an additional minute.
To regulating new and existing power plants. I applaud Representative Whitfield's efforts on this critical piece of legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
We continue to reserve.
The gentleman from California continues to reserve. The gentleman from Kentucky.
At this time, I would like to recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Congresswoman Brooks, for 2 minutes.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 3826 because late last year, the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, went on a listening tour through America to hear from the public about reducing carbon pollution from existing power plants. But unfortunately, the Administrator declined to come to those states most affected by the proposed regulations and instead opted to visit San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston. It's unfortunate that her stops didn't include places like my home state of Indiana, which stands to lose much from these misguided regulations. Because if Ms. McCarthy had taken the time to visit Indiana or other states like Indiana, she would have heard from people like Nina in Anderson, who wrote me an anxious letter about what penalizing the coal industry would do to families on fixed incomes. She explained her church already has had to help many families pay for their electric bill, and she worries about how her community will cope when the EPA's new regulations are enacted. I wish I could tell Nina not to worry, but sadly her fears are very much warranted because the new regulations will have catastrophic impacts on our Hoosier economy. The State Utility Forecasting Group at Purdue University has estimated that, like Ohio, Indiana's electrical rates will increase 32% by 2023 because of EPA rules. The price increase will hurt every Hoosier that turns on a light switch, and it will also cost up to 17,000 jobs in Indiana, permanently ruin the prestige that our state enjoys as being one of the nation's most business-friendly states. That's why I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this important bill, which finally puts the brakes on unchecked EPA regulations and injects much-needed congressional oversight and consultation into the rulemaking agenda. We all have an obligation to leave the world a better place for our children and future generations, but we can't do it when we take away jobs and hurt the economy. That's why I support this bill, and I encourage all my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back.
At this time, I'd like to recognize for 2 minutes the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer, for his statement.
The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Whitfield. I think pretty much everybody I talk to around here is familiar with the fact that North Dakota has 25,000 job openings with fewer than 10,000 people looking for work. It's not an accident. It helps, for sure, to have an 800-year supply of coal under the ground, to have some oil and some gas. But it also is an indication of a regulatory and tax climate that champions work, that champions investment, that doesn't apologize for having the lowest priced electricity rates in the country most times of the year. We also have a robust manufacturing economy as a result of those same policies. Mr. Chairman, I believe that America's economic security and America's national security depends on America's energy security. I would love to see every member of this body come to North Dakota and see what that type of development looks like. And I'd also like to have them breathe some of the cleanest air, see some of the cleanest water, some of the richest topsoil in the world. We're very proud of the fact that we can feed a hungry world while also meeting the growing demands of our economy. And if you really believe that there are several carbon capture technology projects that are viable on power plants in this country, you should love this bill. Because this bill actually prepares the standard for measuring that. It simply states that for 12 consecutive months, 6 power plants, 6 different units, should be able to demonstrate it. And 3 of them being, of course, lignite, which is what we mine in North Dakota. We don't have to compromise quality of life for a high standard of living. We don't do it in North Dakota, and we can replicate it across this country. But the EPA's overreach will hurt that. I think this bill actually helps that, and I'm very proud of my colleague, Mr. Whitfield, for his bicameral, bipartisan approach to this problem and to the solution that you've come up with, and I urge all of my colleagues to vote for it. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
Will the gentleman tell us how much time we have remaining?
It has 7 minutes remaining.
Well, I would reserve my time. I think you all may have it.
Okay, gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say it was unfortunate to make a reference personally to Gina McCarthy, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, on her listening tour. The Republicans have not allotted enough money to EPA to let her go everywhere in the country, so she went to 10 regional offices as well as the Washington headquarters and invited people to come in and give their point of view. That is the full amount of money she had available to her, so it seems to me unfair to criticize her from not going to every nook and cranny in coal country when she went to every part of the country, had a representation for their region. At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to my colleague from the state of California, Mr. Peters.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman and thank you, Mr. Chairman. The proponents of this bill are arguing in part that EPA's plan to require carbon pollution controls under Section 111 is going to hurt electric utilities. But it was just last month in the Utility Air Regulation Group versus EPA case that those same leading utilities argued to the Supreme Court that if EPA intends to address climate carbon pollution, it should act under Section 111, which is what this bill would prevent EPA from doing. The Utility Air Regulatory Group represents about 60 utilities from Duke Energy to the Southern Company to First Energy to the Salt River Project. And on February 24th, they told the Supreme Court that this was the appropriate way for EPA to address carbon pollution from utilities under Section 111. That's exactly what the EPA would do if it were not for this law. Now, I know there may be some ideological desire to deny climate change and simply hope that the issue goes away, but that's not going to happen. More fundamentally, what we're getting caught up today in is this false choice that you again hear over and over again, that you have to choose on one hand between a healthy environment and on the other hand a prosperous economy. Americans deserve nothing less than both. And we have to pay attention to this. And I just offer finally comments from some of our leading health organizations, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Preventive Medicine, the American Lung Association, the American Public Health Association, and others, who point out that cleaning up carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases saves lives. Researchers have found that the efforts enacted now to reduce greenhouse gases, including carbon pollution, from all sources in the United States would prevent more than 16,000 premature deaths by 2030. The lives saved are a result of the reduction in ozone and particulate-forming pollution that is also reduced as carbon is reduced. Cleaning up carbon pollution from power plants is essential to saving those lives. We know that that in turn will save money. So it's important to remember too the economic effect of unregulated carbon does not just extend to the climate, but also to the byproducts of clean air that come and help our economy as well, help people be healthy, and help them ultimately contribute to the economy. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield. Is
this time I'd yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman, Mr. Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, today I rise in support of H.R. 3826. I appreciate the work that the bill's sponsor, Mr. Whitfield, has done on this issue, and I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill. Wisconsin relies on coal for roughly 2/3 of our electric production. Energy costs are consistently one of the main concerns my constituents share with me. The cold winter has made high energy bills the norm throughout Wisconsin, and instead of trying to alleviate these high costs, the EPA is pursuing policies that will drive energy cost prices even higher. The EPA's new source performance standards require that new power plants capture, compress, and store about 40% of the CO2 produced in order to be compliant. However, CCS technology required has not been adequately demonstrated. Ignoring the realities of today's technologies, the EPA is plowing full speed ahead. This action clearly marks yet another salvo in the Obama administration's war on coal. The next volley will be the rules concerning existing power plants. If done incorrectly, these new rules could effectively make it too expensive for our coal-fired power plants to continue operating. While this might be the dream of some, my constituents and yours simply cannot afford it. Fortunately, this bill restores common sense to the EPA's rulemaking process for power plants. By setting reasonable guidelines on the rules concerning new plants and subjecting any rules for current plants to congressional oversight, the bill will ensure that our constituents are able to afford their energy costs. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and to prevent the EPA from unleashing chaos in the energy sector and picking the pockets of consumers. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Do you have Mr. Chairman, may I inquire how much time we have on each side?
Each gentleman has 4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, to close on our side, I yield the balance of the time to the gentleman from the state of Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, a great champion of environmental protection.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. I appreciate your leadership. I appreciate your courtesy in permitting me to speak on this bill. I would like to reference just the comments a moment ago that somehow there isn't available large commercial carbon capture sequestration, that this is somehow a figment. As a matter of fact, there in the United States today, there are 7 large commercial carbon capture sequestration projects operating today. The projects at large commercial fired power plants will come online in the United States and Canada this year. Dr. Julio Friedman, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Clean Coal at the U.S. Department of Energy, recently testified that the first generation of CCS technology is commercially available. You can call up a number of U.S. and international manufacturers, and they will sell you a unit at a large scale for the capture of more than 1 million tons per year, end quote. The idea that CCS technologies for coal are unavailable is simply not true. And I would deeply suggest that this is one of the reasons we're having this bizarre conversation today. We're just sort of out of sync with reality. I strongly oppose H.R. 3826. The debate about this bill is about the reality of dangerous climate change. If you accept modern science, you cannot deny the combined weight of over 10,000 peer-reviewed, published scientific studies which tell us that climate change is happening, is caused by humans, and will have extremely serious impacts. And if you fight wildfires, or you are farming, or run a ski resort, or live in a low-lying coastal area, you're already living with the impacts of climate change on a daily basis. All of these studies and experience are telling us the same thing. Carbon pollution produced by human activities is warming the earth. It's driving more extreme weather events, variability, more heat waves and droughts, more and longer intense wildfire seasons, rising sea levels, melting permafrost, and ocean acidification. Climate disruption is harming economic activities in my state, dealing with agriculture, declining snowpacks, ski resorts, and it's affecting the insurance industry. And it's beginning to impose huge costs on those least able to bear them, people living in the poorest and most vulnerable parts of the world. The United States is a major contributor to climate change, and it cannot be mitigated without us. We have a moral responsibility to act. But H.R. 3826 does just the opposite. It makes the problem worse by preventing EPA from acting in the interests of the environment and our country. Coal-fired plants are the single largest source of carbon pollution. And today, there is no limit on how much carbon pollution they can emit. That's why President Obama directed EPA to use its existing authority under the Clean Air Act to require power plants to control carbon pollution, something long overdue. EPA has proposed a rule to require new coal plants to use available pollution control technology to capture and sequester carbon pollution. For existing plants, EPA is working with stakeholders to think through the best approach. EPA has not yet even issued a proposal, but industry's moving on. In my region, a major utility made the decision on sound economics and environment to shut down a coal-powered plant. H.R. 3826 would stop EPA from issuing any rules and allow these plants to keep emitting unlimited amounts of carbon pollution. And for existing plants, the bill would be straight-out prohibition of any EPA rule from becoming effective unless Congress somehow passed a new law to implement the rule. As a practical matter, this repeals the EPA's existing authority to act. Mr. Chairman, this bill's a dead letter. The Senate will never pass it, and even if he did, the President would veto it, as well he should. But let's spare him the agony and reject this misguided proposal now.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
This time I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman. The Electricity Security and Affordability Act, and I'm also a co-sponsor on this, but I want you to think a little bit, because we've heard a lot of rhetoric on the floor about what's going on, but I want you to understand something, that in Pennsylvania, over 40% of the electricity is generated by coal-fired power plants. If you go back to the election and during the candidacy, the President said very clearly, if you want to continue to produce electricity using coal-fired power plants, you can, but we will bankrupt you. The only thing he didn't add to that was period. That is the war on coal. That is where we're going. And when we talk about these things, and we talk about the numbers of people in our society right now, not just the middle-income people and the lower middle-income people, but the low-income people, what are we affecting? Everything that they put in their mouth, everything that they put on their backs, everything that they do to heat and light their homes. See, the sum total of the cost of anything is everything that goes into it. The cost of energy and using coal to get there just makes sense. Coal has done so much for this country for so many years. I'm not just talking about a few people. And if the chairman on the other side does not believe that this is affecting people, please come back to Western Pennsylvania, walk with me, go into these little towns where there no longer is a coal mine open, and not only that, their towns are shut down. Now, isn't that a marvelous thing to have accomplished and champion, to say, we are doing the right thing for America. We're going to drive your energy cost up. We're going to make it impossible for you to heat and light your homes. We're going to change the cost of everything that you use to raise your children, because it affects the cost of everything. The sum total is made up of energy cost also. What we will do is we will raise the bar so high that it will no longer be possible for these folks to operate at a profitable level. And then we'll back off and say, my goodness, see, they just couldn't meet the standard. And when we ask, what does the standard have to be? Just a little bit better than it is now. And we say, how would we begin to measure it? Well, we haven't determined that yet. We have set standards for you, but we don't have any way of doing it. See, we can't get the point where we can measure the metrics on it. I would just ask you for one thing. I want you to think about those thousands and millions of people who have forever relied on coal, and the electricity that we can supply, and the energy we can supply at a unit that is low enough that they can continue to live a normal life. That is all we're asking. This bill is common sense, which is so devoid in this House. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky has 2 minutes remaining to close.
Well, thank you very much. To conclude this, I would point out to our friends on the other side of the aisle, there's been a lot of discussion today about the availability of carbon capture and sequestration. let's not forget that the Energy Policy Act of 2005 said emission standards will not be set by plants receiving funds from the Clean Energy Initiative at the Department of Energy. And the Kemper plant, referred to my friend from the West Coast, this is the Southern Company, is costing $5 billion. And the president of Southern Company said this plant cannot be consistently replicated on a national level and cannot be the primary basis for new emission standards because they're artificially concocted. So our legislation simply says, in the future, if natural gas prices go up, America, like most every other country in the world, will have the option of building a new coal-powered plant. So I think it's a reasonable approach. It has bipartisan support, and this is the first time that we've been able to have a national debate with this president, who has already made up his mind he does not want coal for America. This is our opportunity to express the opinion of the American people that we need coal moving into the future, and I would urge the adoption of H.R. 3826. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendments under the 5-minute rule. It shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-40. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in House Report 113-373. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report 113-373. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report Number 113-373, offered by Mr. Smith of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we should not stand by and let the EPA tear down America one regulation at a time. So I thank the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, for his work on H.R. 3826, the Electric Security and Affordability Act. Economic growth depends on job creators, not federal regulators. We need to increase access to affordable energy, not take energy options off the table. Now is the time to ensure a robust, all-of-the-above energy strategy that includes our abundant fossil energies as well as nuclear and renewables. But by requiring carbon capture and storage technology that doesn't even exist, the EPA's new power plant proposal effectively bans new coal power. There is no coal power plant anywhere in the world that can meet the EPA's radical proposal. What's equally troubling is that the EPA is planning to require this same unproven technology for new natural gas power. This amendment stops the EPA's attack on natural gas. It prevents the EPA from using make-believe technologies when setting standards. I'm interested in protecting all forms of affordable energy from EPA overreach, including coal, natural gas, and renewables, and that's what this amendment does. Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA is required to rely on a technology that has been adequately demonstrated, in the words of the law. But once again, the EPA is trying to twist the law to suit its extremist agenda. The EPA does this by using an old legal trick. If you can't win the argument as it stands, start arguing about the definition of words. By redefining what the term, quote, adequately demonstrated, end quote, means, the agency is requiring the use of an unproven technology. In so doing, the EPA is making a tremendous power grab, one that reaches well beyond coal.
Only in Washington can you call something adequately demonstrated that doesn't even exist. Over the past few months, it has become increasingly clear that the EPA isn't just going after coal. The administration has no intention of stopping there. Coal may be taking the hardest hit today, but the EPA is gearing up to take down natural gas. This administration has tried to demonize hydraulic fracturing and prevent the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, which would create thousands of jobs and provide many Americans with affordable energy. As America is finding hope in an energy renaissance, the EPA plans to impose harsh power plant requirements on all forms of fossil energy. The EPA and the Department of Energy have already begun to tout these plans around the world. This amendment requires the EPA to rely on proven technologies when it sets rules for any new power plant. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of H.R. 3826 and help prevent the EPA from implementing reckless regulations that disregard the facts. This amendment promotes an all-of-the-above energy strategy, supports good-paying jobs, American manufacturing, and helps us secure energy independence. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
The underlying bill, H.R. 3826, is a radical rewrite of the Clean Air Act. It effectively repeals the EPA's existing authority to address carbon pollution from coal-powered plants. It says that EPA cannot set a standard for new plants unless the standard is already being met by power plants using technologies that can achieve that standard. Well, why would any power plant want to spend the money to use technology to achieve a standard that their competitors do not have to achieve? So it's a chicken and egg problem. You cannot require them to do what they are not already doing. Well, this amendment goes a step further, and it says, well, for natural gas-fired power plants, they shouldn't have to do anything that they're not already doing either. They would block EPA from requiring natural gas-fired power plants to install pollution controls. But the problem is EPA's current proposal for new natural gas plants doesn't require any pollution control technology. EPA is going to set a standard and then let the standard be achieved however the industry would accomplish it. So this amendment would preemptively block EPA from ever considering rules that might further reduce carbon pollution from any future power plants, whether they be coal or natural gas. I think it makes no sense. It's a disaster for the climate, and I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time remains on either side?
From Texas has 1.5 minutes. The gentleman from California has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say to my friend from California, we have one more speaker on this side, and if he's prepared to close, then we will go to our last speaker.
Well, I'm not prepared to close. Okay. I reserve the balance.
And I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, if you look at what's happening with this bill and this amendment, if both were passed, combined coal and natural gas power plants emit a third of all carbon pollution in this country. They're responsible for virtually all carbon pollution from the electricity sector. This amendment would ensure that industry can keep building new fossil fuel power plants without modern pollution controls, whether they be natural gas or coal. So in effect, if this amendment is agreed to and the underlying bill is adopted, it would say, in effect, we're not going to control any of the carbon pollution coming from any power plant. Now, if we don't control the pollution from any power plant and we let them emit whatever pollution they choose to emit, and it's obviously cheaper to pollute than to stop polluting, we will in effect condemn us to all that pollution, which happens to be, let me repeat this again, it happens to be a third of the carbon pollution in this country today. And that would mean there's no chance in hell that we will ever reduce the pollution in this country that we can reduce, that's adding to climate change pollution in addition to all the other pollutants coming from around the world. And those pollutants don't go away. They accumulate in the atmosphere. And when they accumulate in the atmosphere, we see the impact on the climate. But at some point, we're going to have so much pollutant in the atmosphere from carbon that scientists are telling us we won't be able to do anything. We won't be able to continue to contribute that pollution without making it impossible to do anything about climate change. We have a chance to do something about climate change now. We should not lose that chance by adopting this amendment and the underlying bill. So I would urge that we vote against the amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, who is the chairman of the Environment Subcommittee of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to my good friend, the chairman of the Science and Technology Committee. Congratulations on yesterday, and sort of a one step off. I lost the ranking member. Oh, I was going to congratulate him on his years of service now that his decision to leave the body. I'm obviously standing here with two separate points I want to make. One is I actually believe the underlying bill has been substantially misrepresented. If you take the totality of the Clean Air Act, NOx and all the other pollutants that are regulated, that's not what this piece of legislation touches and does. Be that as it may, I'm here to stand up and advocate for amendment number 1, which is very simple in its elegance. It does a very simple thing. It says this bill is not only a discussion about coal, but it's actually a discussion about all fossil fuels. And if we're going to have a regime mechanic that says the science, this technology, once it's properly demonstrated, is appropriate to adopt, should not that demonstration be on other forms of fossil fuels that may be generating power? You know, it's many ways, it's that concept of sort of optionality. If we're going to create a silo that says, hey, these mechanics are only about coal, that's unfair. It should be about all forms of energy, because you'd hate to find out that a year or two from now that the bright, shiny object that I believe the EPA is often chasing has moved to something else, and we've allowed it, a hole here in our amendment process. So that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. All time being expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. No.
Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on this amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 113-373. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report Number 113-373, offered by Mrs. Capps of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Capps, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3826 is about denial. It denies the realities of climate change. It denies the EPA the ability to do its job. The Supreme Court has clearly stated that the EPA has the authority to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. And EPA has used that authority under the Clean Air Act to propose rules to improve the quality and safety of our air. These EPA, or Environmental Protection Act, rules are crucial to mitigating the harmful impacts of climate change, especially given the majority's refusal to take meaningful action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. H.R. 3826 would nullify these proposed rules and restrict EPA's ability to write new ones. This not only does nothing to address climate change, it also creates tremendous uncertainty for the power sector. The bill also bizarrely restricts EPA to considering only pollution control technologies being used in the United States when setting new power plant standards. In other words, if a viable technology is being used abroad, EPA must pretend it doesn't exist. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA must determine the best system of emission reduction for new coal-fired power plants, and it must set standards based on this best technology. But this bill would block EPA from considering pollution controls used outside of the U.S., even if such systems are readily available and proven abroad. As the global leader in innovation and technology, it's absurd that we would bar the EPA from even looking at the best technologies available just because of where it's being used. My amendment would make a common sense correction to this problem. If adopted, it would simply allow the EPA to consider all existing pollution control technologies regardless of where they are being used. For example, the EPA has proposed standards for new coal-fired power plants that would achieve greater carbon pollution reductions through the use of carbon capture and sequestration technology, commonly called CCS. If coal is going to be part of the clean energy future, CCS is precisely the kind of technology that we need to encourage. Understanding this, EPA and others have provided evidence to our committee that CCS is both feasible and available, and that coal-fired power plants with CCS are moving forward. Some of these projects are in the United States, but some of them are being pursued abroad. But without my amendment, these improvements or projects abroad would not be considered by this innovation. This is ridiculous and wrong. I want to be clear. This amendment will not make this a sensible or reasonable bill, and I'll be voting no, even if my amendment should be adopted. But my amendment would at least avoid the embarrassment of the United States Congress requiring a science-based agency to pretend that technologies operating in other countries simply don't exist. I know that some of my colleagues like to deny the science of climate change, but I hope there can be bipartisan agreement that we shouldn't deny science just because it is being used by someone else. Effective CCS technologies are already being installed and used in other countries, including our neighbor to the north. And EPA surely should be allowed to consider these technologies. My amendment would simply ensure that EPA can do its job and consider all available technologies when setting pollution control standards. So I ask my colleagues to support this simple and sensible change and support my amendment. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California reserves the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
To claim time in opposition to
the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
I certainly have a great deal of respect for the gentlelady from California, and I might add, we've heard a lot today about climate change. Former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson herself stated in a hearing, "We will not ultimately be able to change the amount of CO2 that is accumulating in the atmosphere alone." By that, she meant the United States. And there are a couple of reasons she said that. First of all, 96% of CO2 emissions are naturally occurring. Man-made is around 4%. And I might also point out that in the recent fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they acknowledged a lack of warming since 1998, and they acknowledged the growing discrepancy between their climate model projections versus actual readings. So it's not that people are denying, it's that there is a significant difference among the scientific community about what is man-made CO2 contributing and what is naturally occurring CO2 committing. As to the gentlelady's amendment, the Premier of Saskatchewan was in my office today talking about the Canadian project that she referred to. It's not in operation yet. He did say that it would not have been built without government funds, and her amendment would simply say that if it's working in Canada, the EPA could apply that and make it mandatory here. We believe that the Energy Policy Act of 2005 made it illegal for EPA to even set the emission standard that they've set in their proposed rule, and certainly what the gentlelady's amendment would allow is the governments to put in large sums of money to make some projects work that may not in reality be able to be accomplished in the U.S. because of lack of private capital. So if technology is working in another country, it can be brought to America, and if it meets our standards set in paragraphs B and C, it would be able to be utilized. And so for that reason, I would make the argument that the gentlelady's amendment should be rejected, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I would just make the comment, I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding here. I was not implying that if there is a technology in another country such as Canada, it would automatically have to be used in this country. I would just propose in my amendment that we wouldn't want to deny a scientist the opportunity to be able to examine other technologies just because they came from a different country such as Canada.
Well, may I reply, or?
Sure.
We certainly wouldn't.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I mean, what we object to is that the EPA would use that and mandate that private industry build that technology here in the U.S. And I think that your amendment would allow them to do that, and that's what we object to.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I was prepared to close, but I will just add that don't believe the word mandate or required. It was in my amendment. It would just be allowing the consideration of proposals and technologies from other countries than just the United States, as far as my amendment was concerned. But I'll go ahead and complete the amendment. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is simple and straightforward. It makes a small change to the bill, which I just said, which would allow EPA to consider all available technologies when developing pollution control systems. This is an idea that really should have bipartisan support. My colleagues across the aisle often say how the government shouldn't be picking winners.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
And losers. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
The purpose of our legislation is whenever EPA sets the standard, we want the technology to be in the U.S. for at least a year, operating for a year, and 6 units have the proof of that. So that's why we object to the lady's amendment, and I would urge members to vote against her amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I would respectfully request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 113-373. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from West Virginia seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Speaker.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 113-373, offered by Mrs. Capito of West Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentlewoman from West Virginia, Mrs. Capito, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to say that my amendment is a simple clarifying amendment that that is goes right along the discussion we were just having with the previous amendment. It makes clear that in the underlying bill that it does not stop EPA from relying on foreign technologies to establish a performance standard, so long as that foreign technology has been adequately demonstrated at power plants here in the United States. And I think my colleague from Kentucky was making that point in his rebuttal. The Electricity Security and Affordability Act is necessary because the EPA has taken the unprecedented step of requiring the use of technology that has not been demonstrated on a large commercial scale here in the United States. The rule is therefore a de facto ban on new coal plants anywhere in the United States. Well, why is this significant? As our existing coal fleet retires, either due to regulations or because plants have reached the end of their useful life, what takes their place to provide affordable and reliable electricity to families and businesses? In January, when temperatures dropped across the eastern part of the United States, AEP, that provides power in my region of the country, was operating 89% of the coal capacity that will retire in 2015. When that capacity is no longer available, our electric grid will be less reliable and energy prices paid by individuals and small businesses will increase. West Virginia has vast supplies of both natural gas, and coal, so I fully support the development and use of all our domestic energy resources. We need a diverse energy policy that includes coal, natural gas, nuclear, and renewable to support our economic growth and keep the energy bill that families pay each month from skyrocketing. But we cannot turn away from coal, which provides 40% of our nation's electricity and 95% of the electricity in my home state of West Virginia. Other countries understand that coal provides the energy necessary to power their economies. The International Energy Agency released a report in December stating that global coal consumption will continue to rise and increase by more than 2% through 2018. Between 2007 and 2012, global coal consumption increased faster than oil or natural gas. China and India are constructing new coal plants. Even Germany is increasing its coal capacity in 2013. The rest of the world is willing to use coal. We in the United States have a strong competitive advantage because we have hundreds of years of supply. Increasingly, we are exporting coal for use abroad. West Virginia exports more coal than any other state. While we are glad that coal exports are allowing for our production that provide jobs, real jobs in our state, it is difficult to understand why we would turn away from using our own domestic resources at the same time other countries are turning towards our domestic resources. Importantly, unilateral action by the United States will do virtually nothing to address the global problem of carbon dioxide emissions. In 2012, carbon dioxide emissions from energy production in the United States fell by 3.8%. to their lowest levels since the mid-90s. Despite this drop, carbon dioxide emissions from energy globally increased to their highest level on record. China's carbon dioxide emissions alone more than offset the decreased emissions from the United States. That's why I introduced legislation that would delay the implementation of the U.S. carbon dioxide regulations until other countries comprising 80% of non-U.S. emissions enact equally stringent regulations. Acting in concert with our global competitors would minimize the economic consequences and maximize the environmental benefits. Instead, the administration has chosen the opposite course, imposing a unilateral regulation that maximizes our economic pain and minimizes the environmental benefits. EPA's regulations means absolutely fewer West Virginia jobs and higher energy prices for consumers. Let's be clear about what today's legislation does. This legislation does not stop the EPA from regulating greenhouse gas emissions from new coal plants. The bill simply requires EPA to base its regulations on the best performing existing coal plants. We should encourage the implementation of newer, cleaner burning coal technologies, but a de facto ban on new coal plants won't encourage new technologies. It will leave promising research on the shelf while energy prices increase and the economic advantage offered by our natural resources is lost. This is a good, straightforward piece of legislation, and my amendment makes it clear that we want the best commercially available technology to set the standard for new plants, regardless of where that technology is developed, as long as that technology is demonstrated in the United States coal plant. I urge the amendment's adoption and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek to claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
I don't know how to oppose this amendment because it doesn't seem to make the underlying bill any worse. The problem is this. The bill requires that before a new standard for coal power plants is set, there has to be 6 coal power plants in this country that's already using this technology. And we've argued, well, that's not going to happen because no one's going to use the technology if their competitors aren't going to use the technology. And if there's technology outside of this country that's being used successfully, EPA can't rely on that. Ms. Capp's amendment would have changed that. That's still going to be voted on later. Ms. Capito's amendment says EPA can consider technologies developed in other countries, but only if those technologies are also being broadly adopted in the United States, as I understand it. Well, in fact, that will lead to exact same problem as we have in the underlying bill. Under both the amendment and the bill, EPA would still be prevented from proposing a standard based on cleaner coal technologies, such as ultra-supercritical boilers, which can reduce pollution by improving efficiency. That kind of technology is already being used in more than 100 ultra-critical coal units generating power in China. But the United States has only installed 1. But we can't let that 1 and all the others that are being used in China allow the EPA to set a standard that would require that technology. Under the bill and the amendment, that 1 U.S. plant won't be sufficient for EPA to set a new standard. So even if this amendment passes, EPA will still be prohibited from setting pollution control standards based on effective pollution controls that have been deployed overseas. Well, I guess if you're going to pretend that climate change isn't happening, why not pretend that clean air technologies used in other countries don't exist either? So I can't oppose. I'm not going to ask for a roll call vote. I'm not going to even. I'm not going to even vote against your amendment. I'm not going to vote for it. But it seems to me the amendment has a problem that the underlying bill already has, and it doesn't fix anything. So if people want to vote for this amendment, vote for the amendment, because it doesn't make anything any different than the problems that I see with the underlying bill. And with those comments, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the time.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. All time being expired, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from West Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in House Report 113-373. For what purpose does the gentleman from West Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 113-373, offered by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under this legislation, the EPA is required to submit a report to Congress regarding the impacts that this proposed regulation will have on the economy, our competitiveness, our job losses, and electricity rates. Quite frankly, many here in Congress and the constituents we represent across America have come not to trust the EPA to tell the truth about the impacts of the proposed new source performance standard rule or the upcoming existing source rule which will have on our nation. The amendment before us adds stockholders with whom the EPA should consult when finalizing this report. This includes the Energy Information Agency, who will provide the EPA with the necessary statistics and background. It includes the Controller General, who oversees the Government Accountability Office, because the GAO's reports have led to hearings and legislation, billions of dollars in taxpayer savings and improvements to a wide range of government's programs and services. It also includes the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who work with industry to develop and apply our nation's technology, measurements, and standards. And finally, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, under the direction of the Department of Energy. NETO has been leading the charge in working with private sector and academia on developing carbon capture and sequestration technologies. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from West Virginia reserves the balance of his time for what? Does anyone seek recognition in opposition to the amendment? The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the House debate on the Congressman Gardner's bill recently on House Bill H.R. 4480, the Domestic Energy and Jobs Bill, I offered a similar amendment. This amendment passed by voice vote and ensured that NETO had a seat at the table. As background for those who are unaware, NETO is our only government research doing design and development laboratory dedicated to domestic energy sources. Last year alone, NETO worked with academia and the private sector on over 1,000 projects. This represented over 55,000 jobs and $12 billion in project funding in every state and nearly every congressional district. It's only fitting that they, along with others, are included in this process. Let's be clear here. If we support transparency by having relevant agencies consult with the EPA, these same agencies who provide with us with statistics, develop our standards, develop our technology, and keep our agencies and Congress in line in accountability, then you would support this amendment. Members of Congress consult with their staff, their respective committees, other members' offices, and their constituents, so it's fitting the EPA should do the same under this amendment. Chairman Whitfield and his staff are to be commended for their hard work to putting together such an incredible bipartisan effort in this legislation. I'm a proud co-sponsor to work with them and encourage all my colleagues to support this amendment and, more importantly, the underlying bill. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from West Virginia yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from West Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Thank you. It is now in order to consider amendment number 5, printed in House Report 113-373. For what purpose does the gentleman from West Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in House Report number 113-373, offered by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Once again, I'd like to reference Section 3 of the underlying bill. The amendment would strengthen the analysis and reporting the EPA is required to develop under this legislation. One of the problems in our coal, gas, and oil industry face is the vast and ideologically motivated regulations they must endure, such as the New Source Performance Standard. However, other nations don't seem to be impose such burdensome policies and regulations on their industries. Instead, countries in the Middle East and Asia promote their fossil fuel businesses and work to make it easier for those countries to get their fossil fuels to market. Mr. Chairman, it's called fairness. Now I'm sure you'll hear that some of the opponents of this in the past have said that this amendment falsely claims that this amendment is flawed and too broad. We've heard that this amendment might open up Pandora's box, as issues we heard from our friends 2 years ago when I offered a similar amendment. That's simply not true, not accurate. This amendment and legislation will make certain that the United States remains viable in its manufacturing on a global scale. It ensures that we don't put more people and their families or children on the street or with uncertainty, and we can provide them with certainty and access to abundant and affordable electricity. This amendment is about protecting our liberties and providing transparency. With that, Mr. Chairman, I ask the reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition to the amendment so I can make a few points.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
I didn't speak on the last amendment. I didn't think that last amendment did anything worse than the bill already does. This amendment modifies a section of the underlying bill which requires EPA to report to Congress on the economic impacts of any regulation of carbon pollution from existing fossil fuel-fired power plants. Well, this reporting requirement is largely meaningless because EPA already does this analysis, and if this bill were adopted, EPA wouldn't issue any rules to trigger the reporting requirement anyway. But this amendment would add more items to be considered in EPA's report on a rule regulating carbon pollution from existing power plants. For example, this bill would require EPA to look at the rule's potential effects on capital and operation and maintenance costs for pollution control equipment. But that's exactly what EPA already does for every significant rule that requires pollution controls. The amendment also requires EPA to analyze how a particular pollution control requirement may affect the global economic competitiveness of the United States. I don't think that makes any sense to add this because it's questionable whether we even have reliable economic models to make this assessment. If this bill were adopted, EPA wouldn't be doing this report anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to object to the amendment. I'm not going to vote for the amendment. But it won't have any effect because the underlying bill is going to prevent EPA from acting, whether it's a new power plant or existing power plants. But this, I did want to single out this provision, which I think is unreasonable to expect EPA to be able to do this global economic competitiveness analysis. That's not what EPA does. They're not in a position to do it. And to add that requirement, I think, is a very bad precedent. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Waxman. Under this amendment, the EPA is required, as he just stated, is required to take into account the economic impacts this rule could have on our global competitiveness and require capital investments and costs for operation and maintenance of new equipment. We know that under the New Source Performance Standard rule, the cost of electricity could skyrocket by as much as 70%. This cost will be passed on to the consumers. Consequently, we American manufacturers will indeed be put at a global disadvantage, and many will lose their business. We've seen testimony by economists, academics, and scientists who say that under this proposed regulation, capital costs will increase by as much as 110%. This is unconscionable. At a time when Saudi Arabia, China, and India are helping their job creators thrive and open up global opportunities for them, this administration and its ideologically motivated EPA are exporting jobs, creating uncertainty, and trying to decarbonize America with little to show for health and economic benefits. The EPA needs to look at what other nations are doing to grow, stabilize, and sustain their fossil fuel industries. This amendment will help us show how we can improve and stop hindering the development of our natural resources. Ultimately, I offer this amendment because we are supposed to be a nation leading by example over the rest of the world. With nearly 23 million people underemployed or unemployed, we really ought to be saying to our regulators, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Mr. Chairman, again, I wish to thank Mr. Upton and Whitfield for their support of this amendment and the underlying bill that goes with it. Mr. Whitfield's work on the overall bill shows his true leadership in caring for the people of Appalachia and all across all of America. This country is a leader in the world. an innovator, and a job creator. It's time that it reins in excessive regulations that create burdens, resulting in families, children, husbands, spouses, worried about tomorrow. It's time that our regulators pull back in. This amendment and this legislation overall will create that ability that we have an American dream again, but not an American dream that's driven by regulations. I urge all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment
Will the
and
gentleman
ultimately
yield
the
to
bill.
me?
And I yield back the
Will the
balance of
gentleman
my-
yield to me?
balance of my time.
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
I yield back.
You won't do it. Okay.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from West Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in House Report 113-373. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
To offer an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in House Report number 113-373, offered by Ms. Schweikert of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schweikert, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois.
Thank you. I yield myself 4 minutes.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 4 minutes.
My dear colleagues, this is the simplest of simple amendments. It asks of this House only one thing: to acknowledge the truth of these words, quote, greenhouse gas pollution is contributing to long-lasting changes in our climate that can have a range of negative effects, unquote. Our country and this Congress are at a critical moment in the history of our small planet. But we are privileged as leaders of the most powerful country on earth to be in a position to lead the world in combating climate change. There is still time. And if we act now, we can protect our natural resources like water and promote job growth and ensure that our descendants are able to live healthy lives on this planet long after we're gone. Making the right choice begins with accepting the fact of climate change. It's hard to ignore this reality. The 10 hottest years in human history all occurred since 1998. This time last year, we had just completed the hottest year ever in the United States, a full degree hotter in terms of average temperature than the previous record. Though we are dealing with cold in many parts of the U.S. this year, the scientists tell us global temperatures are continuing to warm. Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau, among others, will be submerged during this century unless meaningful action is taken. Here at home, we're seeing more and more severe droughts, wildfires, storms, and hurricanes, often all in the same year. There are tremendous economic incentives for the United States to take climate change seriously. In December, the Pew Charitable Trust estimated that the clean energy sector could generate $1.9 trillion in revenue from 2012 to 2018. And we also know that there are 3 times as many jobs created per dollar spent on renewable energy than on fossil fuel. As we work to create an economy that supports 21st century jobs, how can we overlook one of the world's fastest growing industrial sectors and the millions of jobs it would support? Large multinational corporations have joined environmentalists and scientists and the vast majority of the American public who recognize the impact of carbon pollution on our world. For example, Coca-Cola has already suffered from a global water shortage that is driving up costs, and Coke has recognized climate change as a challenge to its future profitability. The business plans of ExxonMobil and the other big 5 oil companies assume they will have to pay for the cost of carbon in the future. This Congress should recognize the same facts that these business leaders have accepted. Climate change is real and requires a different game plan. History will not be kind to climate change deniers. The Schweikert-Lowenthal amendment doesn't ask for much. It doesn't change the bill's provisions. It simply asks, as 21st century leaders of the most powerful country in the world, to say yes to this simple fact.
Climate change is real and can have negative consequences. And Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time to my co-sponsor of this legislation, Mr. Lowenthal. How much time remains?
Gentlewoman has a minute and a half remaining.
Actually, I reserve the balance
Gentlewoman
of my
reserves.
time. Yes, thank you. What was it?
Reserve.
Thank you.
No, he's going to go.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
To oppose the gentlelady's amendment, and I have a great deal of respect and admiration.
I'm sorry, excuse me. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I have a great deal of respect and admiration for the gentlelady from Illinois, and I might say this legislation would never have been necessary if EPA had adopted a standard that had been adequately demonstrated and was not in violation of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. I would also say that in wanting to add this language to the bill, EPA itself, in discussing its proposed regulation, projected that its rule would result in almost zero CO2 emission changes or quantified benefits and costs by 2022. So even EPA does not think that their regulation is going to really significantly reduce CO2 emissions, because 96% of CO2 emissions are naturally occurring, less than 4% are man-made. And I might also just point out once again that no one is a denier of climate change, but more and more scientists seem to be disagreeing with the impact of man-made CO2 versus naturally occurring CO2. After the fifth assessment report of the International Panel on Climate Change in the fall of last year, a group of scientists from the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, in a 1,200-page report with thousands of references to peer-reviewed papers, made the argument that natural forces, not man-made forces, is really driving the Earth's climate. And so we're particularly concerned that this regulation would prevent America with the flexibility in the future. If natural gas prices go up, we would not have the option, like most every other country in the world, of building a coal plant. And so that's why we respectfully oppose her amendment, and I would yield the balance of my yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized.
I think she.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Right. I thank the gentlewoman from Illinois for yielding and for being a steadfast leader on this issue. Mr. Chairman, this amendment simply confirms what the world's scientists already know, that greenhouse gases contribute to long-lasting changes in our climate that can have a range of harmful effects. Disinformation by entities with conflicts of interest have fueled reports of scientific disagreement. However, the scientific community is not divided, because there is no compelling scientific evidence denying humans' role in climate change. Period. Case closed. Every minute we waste on the myth of disagreement is a minute longer we wait to take concrete action, making our inevitable energy transition even more expensive. Mr. Chairman, we will be judged by our children for what we do here today. I urge an aye vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
How much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman from Kentucky has 3 minutes remaining.
Okay. In reply to this case closed argument, I would just point out that the fifth assessment report of the International Panel on Climate Change, which came out in the fall, acknowledged a lack of warming since 1998 and a growing discrepancy between the model projections and the reality of the observations actually made, that discrepancy between the models and reality were increasing. It also acknowledged that the evidence of decreased climate sensitivity to the increases in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. It also acknowledged evidence that sea level rising during the period 1920 to 1950 was the same as in 1995 to 2012. Now that's the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change. And with that, I would just respectfully request that we defeat the gentlelady's amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized.
Yes, I would like a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Illinois will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 3826, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 3826 and has come to no resolution thereon. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 501. Resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2824 to amend the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977 to stop the ongoing waste by the Department of the Interior of taxpayer resources and implement the final rule on excess spoil, mining waste, and buffers for perennial and intermittent streams and for other purposes. Providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 2641 to provide for improved coordination of agency actions in the preparation and adoption of environmental documents for permitting determinations and for other purposes, and providing for consideration of motions to suspend the rules.
Referred to the House calendar and order printed.
Statement.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole and the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 3826. Will the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holgram, kindly resume the chair?
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House of the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 3826, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to provide direction to the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency regarding the establishment of standards for emissions of any greenhouse gas from fossil fuel-fired electric utility generating units and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose earlier today, a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 6, printed in House Report 113-373, offered by the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schweikert, had been postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report 113-373. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to offer my amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report Number 113-373, offered by Mr. Latta of Ohio.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of my amendment to H.R. 3826. This amendment would make a clarification to the bill to make explicit that demonstration projects refer to projects that have received federal government funding or assistance. This responds to comments raised when the bill was marked up that the definition of demonstration project could be construed to sweep in any projects receiving government support, including local tax assistance. This amendment helps clarify the bill and also highlights provisions of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which apply to the EPA's proposed standards for new plants. The Energy Policy Act expressly prohibits EPA from considering technologies of federally funded projects under DOE's Clean Coal Power Initiative to be adequately demonstrated. The purpose of this is to prevent the premature mandating of technologies that are not commercially viable. EPA's determination that carbon capture and storage, or CCS technologies for new coal-fired powered plants have been adequately demonstrated is not borne out in the real world. In the agency's proposed rule, the EPA cites 4 government-subsidized CCS power plant demonstration projects that are in various stages of planning development. First, Southern Company's Kemper County, Mississippi project is still under construction, subject to delays and cost overruns. In the company running the project's own words, this plant, and I quote, cannot be consistently replicated on a national level and should not serve as a primary basis for the new emission standards impacting all new coal-fired power plants. Next, Summit's Texas Clean Energy Project is still in the planning stage. It does not yet have financing and has also been subject to multiple delays. The third project, Hydrogen Energy California's LLC's project, is still in the planning and permitting stages. Lastly, Sask Power's Boundary Dam CCS project is a government-funded small 110 megawatt facility rebuild project in Canada, still under construction, reportedly $115 million over budget. It seems very clear to the companies and institutions most involved with the CCS projects they are not yet ready to be considered for commercial development. As one Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy in the Obama administration suggested, it is disingenuous for the EPA to say that CCS is ready. It should be very clear to American taxpayers that this administration is working day and night to eliminate the use of coal in this country. In places like my home state of Ohio, where 78% of our energy comes from coal, the result would be higher electric bills for our families and seniors already dealing with increased health care costs as a result of Obamacare. We should be pursuing energy policies that will lead to more energy that is less expensive for people rather than energy that is more expensive for our citizens. As we know, increased energy costs impact the most vulnerable citizens in our country. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition so I can make some comments.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
The underlying bill prevents EPA from setting a standard or requirements for new coal-powered plants. Instead of telling a new coal power plant they have to use technology to reduce their carbon emissions, this bill says they can't require that of new plants unless new plants are already using technology to reduce emissions. Well, okay, if they're already using technology, we can say everybody ought to use that technology. But then the underlying bill goes further and says, well, not only that they're using technology that accomplishes the goal, but it's got to be 6 plants, representative all over the country, that are achieving this standard using technologies. And then EPA can consider a standard for new power plants. This is like the belts and suspenders. They can't look at foreign technology. They have to use 6 plants that are using technology. Of course, one would ask, why would anybody spend money to use technology to reduce carbon pollution if they're not required to do it? It costs money. So it's so unlikely that they're ever going to be able to set a new standard at the Environmental Protection Agency, given the underlying bill. But the bill also says if there are 6 plants that are using technology, they better not use technology that's been funded by the government. Well, why not? That's what the government does. We provide DOE grants to have demonstrations of new technologies. That's what the underlying bill says. If they're achieving reductions in carbon pollution because it's involving government funds, we're not going to count those. Well, now we have the Alada amendment says, well, wait a second. What if it's funds for demonstrations that's not using federal dollars but local dollars? Well, fine. I don't have any objection to that. But I don't know why we would say federal dollars can't be used for to demonstrate technologies that are successful. So the Alada amendment narrows the underlying bill, but really doesn't accomplish much. Why, I'd ask, would we want to say that the Department of Energy, using taxpayers' dollars for projects to find new and better ways to improve air quality for the American people, should not be used by EPA to set a standard for future power plants? These projects, funded by the federal government, help companies figure out how to reduce air pollution more effectively and at a lower cost. The whole point is to develop technologies that can be applied across the industry to reduce air pollution. So if the federal government funds those new technologies and they're successful, we're not going to let a standard be based on that. But if the state funds the development of the new technologies that accomplish these goals, oh, we can use that. But they better be part of 6. And they better fit this underlying standard, this underlying requirement that there be 6 in different parts of the country, and on and on and on. Well, I don't object to this amendment. I don't see what the amendment particularly does to make the bill any better. It doesn't solve any particular problem that I see, but I just want to point out how offensive this underlying bill is, to not let EPA set standards for new plants when we know that technologies can reduce the carbon pollution, but we're not going to look at it for real unless they meet a higher standard, which is 6 plants. But they better not be using government-funded technologies from the federal government, which would be the case if this amendment's adopted. So I just want to make these points rhetorically because I think people ought to understand how offensive this bill is, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve. Does the gentleman have any further? Do you yield back?
Well, I may inquire of the chair, who closes the debate on this amendment?
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report 113-373. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report Number 113-373, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 497, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, President Obama reached out to the Congress, to the Republican majority of this House, and he said, let's work on ideas that could help us deal with this problem of climate change. But he also said he wanted to make it very clear that if the Republicans won't act, because this House majority won't do anything to address climate change, he will. The bill we're considering today shows that the Republicans' plan on climate change is to give up hope. Their plan is to let our children and grandchildren suffer the effects of climate change without lifting a finger to protect them. Whereas the Republicans' plan is to stop any meaningful action to slow climate change. I think their position is indefensible. Today's bill would amend the Clean Air Act to ensure that coal-fired power plants are able to pollute indefinitely with impunity. This bill would condition EPA's authority on conditions that simply can never be met, or at least not as long as it's cheaper to dump pollution into the air rather than clean it up. Republicans complain they don't like EPA's approach. Well, what's their plan to address climate change? For years, Democratic members have shown that we're willing to consider any suggestion to reduce carbon pollution and to slow climate change. We could put a price on carbon. We could put a limit on carbon pollution. We could support the development of clean energy. In the bill that I authored with now Senator Markey, we dedicated $60 billion to deploy carbon capture and sequestration technology on new coal power plants. But what Congress can't do is simply to say no to everything. No to a price on carbon, no to a limit on carbon, no to regulation on carbon. What my amendment suggests is if they don't want EPA to act to reduce the pollution from carbon coming from coal power, burning power plants, we're saying, all right, address this problem. Make sure we have some other alternative that will work. Because if they don't have an alternative that will work, in effect the Republicans are saying, we're not going to do anything. Either we don't believe there's a problem called climate change, the scientists are all lying to us. Of course, we'll never let them come before our committee and testify, because they'll only lie to us about it. The science is wrong. We don't have to worry about it. We've heard over and over again from Mr. Whitfield, 96% of the problem is naturally occurring carbon. Well, naturally occurring carbon is balanced. It's absorbed by photosynthesis and other processes. But that 4% is upsetting the balance. And that balance that's being upset is a threat to this planet. It's a threat to our atmosphere. It's a threat to our nation when we see hurricanes, floods, droughts, all these climate events that we hear about every night in the evening news. And so, what is their alternative? They don't want coal-burning power plants regulated? Give us an alternative that will reduce that 4% that's upsetting the balance. And I would suggest that they are telling us they have no alternative whatsoever. I don't think that's an adequate answer to what many experts believe is the leading threat to our survival on this planet. So I would urge that we adopt this amendment. If they don't like what EPA is doing, tell us their plan. If they have other ideas for reducing carbon pollution to prevent catastrophic climate change, let's hear them. But if they don't, they should step aside and let the President lead. I urge support for this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
To speak in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would point out once again, as I did in the beginning of this debate, that the constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley, testifying before the Judiciary Committee recently, made the statement that if left unchecked, the United States President could effectively become a government unto himself because of excessive executive orders and excessive regulations. And the only reason that we're here today is that the President, without any really national debate, went to Copenhagen and other international groups and made commitments to for the U.S. on the reduction of CO2 emissions. In the energy sector, our emissions are the lowest that they've been in 20 years. If EPA had adopted emission standards and technology was available that had been adequately demonstrated to meet those standards, we wouldn't have any problem. But they did not do that. In fact, they violated the 2005 Energy Policy Act in setting these emission standards. So we tried to talk to EPA. We tried to talk to the President. We tried to talk to his representatives. And we got the cold shoulder. So the only option available to us in trying to overcome these executive orders and regulations is to adopt some legislation. In our legislation, we don't expect a coal plant to be built. But if natural gas prices go up, America, like every other country in the world, practically will be able to build a coal plant, and the technology will be available to meet those emission standards. So with that, I would respectfully oppose the gentleman's amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment doesn't stop EPA from acting if we can get an alternative that would reduce the carbon pollution to the same level the EPA is proposing. And my friend and colleague, Mr. Whitfield, said the President, if left unchecked, would make these commitments. Well, President George H.W. Bush made a commitment on behalf of this country that we would try to achieve reduction of carbon to 1990 levels. If the Republicans want to do something on their own and not let the President do it, tell us how you can accomplish these goals. If you don't want to achieve these goals, it's either because you don't believe we need to achieve them, or you're not willing to do anything about the problem. I urge support for the amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I would just say that we believe the President's views are extreme when he sets a goal of reducing by 83% below the 2005 emission levels. And for that, we think this legislation is absolutely essential to give the American people the flexibility in the future to build a coal plant to help meet the electricity needs of this great country. And with that, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I request a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having under consideration H.R. 3826, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has under consideration H.R. 3826 and has come to no resolution thereon. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Without objection?